Could you tell us a little bit more about how lack of sleep and or sacrificing sleep can also lead to a cognitive decline?
A really famous study was done by a man named Hans van Dongen. It was published in 2001. And he took people and gave them different amounts of sleep for a couple of weeks. So in one condition, people were deprived of sleep entirely. This didn't persist for the whole 2 weeks, but they didn't have any sleep whatsoever. But in the other conditions, they had varying amounts from about 4 hours of sleep to about 8 hours of sleep. When I say 8 hours of sleep, I mean they had a 4-hour sleep opportunity or an 8-hour sleep opportunity. And as the days went by, they looked at cognitive function in those different groups and how it changed over time. And they also asked people their perceptions of how well they were performing. And what they found was that while people felt that when they weren't getting enough sleep, their performance initially deteriorated, but then plateaued at a level that was lower than normal, objectively, people continued to get worse and worse in the measures they looked at. And so they looked at vigilance, but they also looked at things like the ability to add and subtract numbers too. And all these different cognitive functions that they looked at did indeed get worse over time.
Are you struggling with stress and sleep? Do you find that the more stressed out you are, the less you sleep, and it starts a vicious cycle? You wake up feeling exhausted and even more stressed out because you didn't sleep well. If this sounds like you, this week's podcast episode is exactly what you need to listen to. I have chosen an exceptional sleep expert for you to talk about these sleep stress issues. His name is Greg Potter, and he has a PhD in sleep science, metabolism, and circadian rhythm. His insights on sleep science will help you improve your sleep, but also alleviate day-to-day stress. In today's episode, you will learn some easy, practical tips that you can start using right away to help you sleep better, stress less, and wake up feeling refreshed, like you've hit the reset button on your day. Let's dive in, and I hope you will enjoy listening to today's episode as much as I enjoy recording it with Greg. I'm delighted to have Greg with us today, and we are going to focus this conversation around the theme of sleep and insomnia and how we can improve our sleep protocol and sleep hygiene daily with really actionable tool and practical advice. Greg, I'm delighted to have you on the Charlene Giselle Show.
Thanks, Charlene. Nice to be here.
Lovely to have you. I was wondering if we could perhaps start by asking you what compelled you to choose to undertake a PhD on the topic of sleep metabolism and circadian rhythm.
It really was to fill a void in my knowledge because up until that point, I've been very interested in physical activity, exercise science, and nutrition. I joke that I had a misspent youth because I became interested in those subjects when I was about 12. I hurt my back playing rugby, and that coincided with becoming interested in girls too. So I started going to the gym and wanted to look better and started thinking more about how I was eating and so on, and ended up at university and studied sport and exercise science for my undergrad and did a lot of coaching at that time and increasingly realized that I wasn't helping people as effectively as I could. So after my master's, which was in exercise physiology, I started applying for different PhD programs. And during my master's, I started reading some of the research on sleep and biological rhythms. So I was looking at opportunities related to that. I ended up at the University of Leeds and studied sleep nutrition and metabolic health. And really, the thing that unites all of the work that I do now is trying to help people with their health and performance through lifestyle changes. And so I don't see myself as a specialist in any one thing, but really I try and understand how all these different things relate to each other and just use whichever tools are appropriate in a given context.
And could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about the connection between sleep, lifestyle in general, nutrition, light exposure or light of light exposure? It all really ties in together, right? Because typically somebody who is going to stay up at night is going to be most likely to eat snacks and go for pizza or ice cream and then wake up feeling groggy and not work out. So there is either a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about how those connect?
I'll give a couple of examples to try and clarify what we're speaking about here. So if we focus on the relationship between exercise and mood, for instance, then in the last few years, there have been several reviews, some in high profile journals, showing that exercise is quite a potent antidepressant. And actually, some of the evidence suggests that it's similarly efficacious to widely used antidepressant medications, so things like SSRIs and SNRIs. And it's thought that some of the reason that exercise is so helpful is that it improves sleep. And there was some research published in the last few years showing that improvements in sleep actually probably mediate many of the positive effects of exercise on mood. So if you take someone who has depression and you give them a structured exercise training program and you look at how their sleep architecture changes, the proportion of time that they spend in different stages of sleep, how those are chained together, what you see is that following appropriate exercise training, their sleep architecture looks much more like someone who doesn't have depression or another mood disorder. And so it's likely that sleep is doing a lot of work in the background. And had people not looked at the effects of exercise on sleep, we might have assumed that it was something about the exercise per se, but maybe sleep is actually contributing a lot to that. If we take another example, you mentioned sleep and nutrition. A common goal of people is to lose some body fat. And they might be doing things really well in the kitchen. They might have an appropriate exercise training program too. But if they're sleeping poorly, then their body composition won't improve as much as they would like. There's some nice research by some scientists at the University of Chicago nearly 15 years ago now, showing that if you put people on standardized fat loss diets and you control what they eat, you have one group of people who have an adequate sleep opportunity and another group that has restricted sleep, then what you find is that the people who don't get enough sleep lose a substantially smaller proportion of their mass as fat mass. So they lose less body fat and they lose more fat-free mass, so more muscle tissue, bone tissue, and so on. And that's when the diet is controlled. But we also know that most people respond to insufficient sleep by eating more too. Looking across studies, on average, people consume roughly 250 calories more each day if they don't get enough sleep. There's variation between people. Some people actually eat less when they don't get enough sleep, but most people eat more, and some people eat a lot more. And it's not just that they eat more, they also tend to favor less healthy foods too. There's been some entertaining research, for instance, showing that if you take people and you put them in a mock supermarket and you give them a certain amount of money to spend, they will purchase more calories worth of food when they've been sleep deprived than when they're rested. And so the sleep deprived brain tends to favor smaller, sooner rewards like delicious foods. Pass me that donut, pass me that piece of cake, than larger, later rewards like a better, more attractive physique and better metabolic health. So those are just some examples, but really, in order to understand how all these different things tie together, we have to do quite expensive and difficult studies where we're measuring lots of different things simultaneously. And then we use unbiased methods to try and work out what's causing what.
I love that you just talked about how lack of sleep can lead to shift in behaviors, and you gave this great example about your food choices. Could you tell us a little bit more about how, based on your research and based on your firsthand and client experience as well, lack of sleep and or sacrificing sleep can also lead to a cognitive decline and actually not being quite as performant as one would be with appropriate sleep?
That's been very well demonstrated. And one of the tricky things with studying cognition is just that people tend to use certain validated tests over and over again. So if you look across these types of studies, then they tend to rely on very specific cognitive tests like the psychomotor vigilance test, maybe some measures of working memory and so on. And those aren't necessarily representative of the types of cognitive functions and how we use those to navigate the world each day, to perform at work and so on. But if we bear that caveat in mind, then I'll give a couple of examples that are relevant. A really famous study was done by a man named Hans van Dongen. It was published in 2001. And he took people and gave them different amounts of sleep for a couple of weeks. So in one condition, people were deprived of sleep entirely. This didn't persist for the whole 2 weeks, but they didn't have any sleep whatsoever. But in the other conditions, they had varying amounts from about 4 hours of sleep to about 8 hours of sleep. When I say 8 hours of sleep, I mean they had a 4-hour sleep opportunity or an 8-hour sleep opportunity. And as the days went by, they looked at cognitive function in those different groups and how it changed over time. And they also asked people their perceptions of how well they were performing. And what they found was that while people felt that when they weren't getting enough sleep, their performance initially deteriorated, but then plateaued at a level that was lower than normal, objectively, people continued to get worse and worse in the measures they looked at. And so they looked at vigilance, but they also looked at things like the ability to add and subtract numbers too. And all these different cognitive functions that they looked at did indeed get worse over time. There's variation between people and how well they cope with sleep loss. And there are some people who might continue to perform quite well in the face of sleep loss. And this is probably true of many of the people who work incredibly hard for years and somehow they manage to keep businesses running. You look at the Bill Gateses of the world. I don't know anything about Bill Gates' sleep, but that type of person, they might be quite unusual in how they cope with things like insufficient sleep and some other forms of stress. But clearly there is something going on there. And if we think about brain health in general, which is very relevant to your ability to perform well at work, because work isn't just cranking through cognitive tasks. There's also how well you manage people, for instance. So let's say that you're in a leadership position at work. There's been some work by Christopher Barnes, who's at the University of Washington, showing that sleep-deprived leaders take more abusive leadership styles. And they're also more likely to take risks. And ultimately, that could compromise the entire business at some point. And then there are things like these naturalistic experiments where you look at how people spend time on the internet at work, or they use their time at work at different times of year. And what you find is that as people go into daylight savings time, the clocks change and they lose a bit of sleep. They engage in more of what's called cyber loafing, where they're basically sat at their desk looking like they're working, but really they're just messing around on the internet. And so actually this probably has quite far-reaching consequences. And there are some people who might be able to cope quite well, but there will be some people who will be decimated. And the good news is that it's not all bad news, because if you're going through a period of poor sleep, let's say that you're a new parent and you just had your first child, your sleep has temporarily gone out the window. There are things that you can do to support your brain function and your general health at that time. So going back to the idea that these different facets of lifestyle interact, as one example, if you look at how people perform in cognitive tasks in rooms that are differently lit after insufficient sleep than people who are exposed to brighter light that's richer in shorter wavelengths, tend to perform better in cognitive tasks. So the implication of that is that if you want to perform well when you're not sleeping well, you want to sit by a window and turn the lights up so they're nice and bright and spend plenty of time outdoors as well. Similarly, there's work showing that people who haven't had enough sleep, when they do physical activity, they offset some of the negative metabolic changes of that insufficient sleep, things like deterioration in blood sugar control, but they also better maintain their cognition than when they don't do the exercise. And so you can think about these different aspects of lifestyle as being a bit like the legs of a stool. If you imagine a stool with many different legs, you could temporarily get rid of one leg, let's say it's sleep. And if you manage to maintain the other legs through eating appropriately, through being physically active, through appropriate patterns of light exposure and so on, then you probably continue to support your function.
I love that you mentioned the term sleep architecture, and I think it's a brilliant term. And I was wondering if we could perhaps elaborate a little bit on how one can become a sleep architect, especially one who is busy, work pressure, maybe, 1, 2 children, and has a lot to do, too little time to do it. Pretty classic story. How can one take small, incremental, daily measures and tactics to improve their sleep?
I think some of this is using your time effectively. So if you go back to the idea that things like being physically active are good for sleep health, and then in turn good for other aspects of health, then nowadays there's lots of literature showing that relatively brief bouts of very vigorous intensity activity can quite dramatically improve various different health and performance parameters when done consistently over time. So I think some of it relates to the nature of what you're doing, the composition of what you're doing. But thinking about trying to navigate that type of life, I think you're going to be time poor, you're going to be under stress, you're going to probably make many decisions without too much thought because you've got really important things to focus on and you just don't have the time to worry about the minutiae. And given that, it's really important to shape your environment to making healthier choices as easy as possible. And so doing things like having healthy snacks and setting up your environment in a way that supports your health is going to be really important. So if we focus on sleep specifically, then that might mean making some changes to your home environment to support your sleep health, which could mean fitting new light bulbs, for example. So if right now you have lights which are quite cold looking, so the light looks quite white or even slightly green or slightly blue in your home, and you normally just have those on overhead up until when you go to bed and then you turn them off at the last minute, you might change your light environment so that for the 3 hours before you go to sleep, you reduce the intensity of the light exposure and you also change the color of the light. So rather than relying on those overhead light bulbs, you might get some lamps that you put in your environment that have a more amber hue that mimic firelight. And that really is the kind of light that we evolved to thrive in at that time. If you think about our distant ancestors, then after the sun was down, they would have had exposure to firelight, starlight, and moonlight. And sure enough, that type of light exposure is conducive to sleeping well. So buying warm white light bulbs and maybe relying on lamps rather than overhead lights might be part of it. You might change your mattress. A lot of people haven't given much thought to their mattress, but perhaps you and your bed partner have quite different preferences. You can get mattresses that are different in their support, for example. So one side might be firmer than the other side, and the heavier person might benefit from more support than the lighter person. Similarly, you might have quite different thermal preferences. The old joke is that women are always too cold and men are always too hot in bed. And there does seem to be quite a consistent thermal preference difference between the sexes, such that women on average prefer a temperature that's about 2 degrees higher. And so if that's the case, you might have separate duvets if you're sharing a bed. And the person who prefers higher temperatures might have a higher TOG duvet than the person who wants a cooler bed. So there are these types of changes that you can make. But otherwise, what I see in my coaching practice is that a lot of people who are struggling with their sleep feel like they've tried everything. And this is especially true of people who have insomnia. They've read all of the usual sleep hygiene hacks. They're sleeping in a cool bedroom. They are using blackout blinds or wearing an eye mask. They're using earplugs, perhaps. And they come to me and they say, I've done it all. I'm not consuming any caffeine anymore. I barely drink alcohol now. And I'm broken. I just can't sleep. But there are 2 or 3 things that they've never tried and that are pretty much always effective. And I know before we started recording, Charlene, you mentioned stimulus controller behavior and how I posted something on Instagram about that. And this is a perfect example of those interventions that most people haven't tried and aren't aware of that are really helpful. And actually, we can apply stimulus controller behavior to making healthier decisions more straightforward in general. So we can apply this to nutrition and exercise and so on. I'll come back to that. But in the case of insomnia, what happens is that over time, as people spend more time awake in bed, struggling to sleep, they start to associate being in bed with being frustrated at their inability to sleep. And you can end up having something called conditioned arousal, where someone might be absolutely exhausted and they think to themselves, finally, I'm going to sleep well tonight because I'm so tired. And they go to bed and suddenly they feel wide awake. They feel tired and wired. And that is conditioned arousal because their brain has made that association between the bed and difficulty sleeping. And so they need to train themselves to reassociate the bed with sleep and sleep only. And they do this by applying stimulus control of behavior principles. So in this instance, the stimulus is the bed, and the behavior that it's controlling is wakefulness. And we need to recondition that association by applying a handful of principles. So the first one is only go to bed when you're actually sleepy. If it's 10 p.m. and you think my bedtime is 10 p.m., but 10 p.m. rolls around, you're not sleepy, don't go to bed then, wait until you're sleepy. Another is when you go to bed and you are intending to sleep, turn off the lights and put your earplugs in, you've got your eye mask on. If you haven't fallen asleep within roughly 15 minutes, get out of bed, go to a different room, do something relaxing and dim lighting until you feel sleepy again, and only then return to bed. And you don't have to watch the clock. Certainly wouldn't recommend that. That can produce something called clock watching anxiety, which you don't want. So just go by your sense of time passing, but repeat that as many times as necessary through the night. So initially you might have to do that several times a night, and you therefore want to make it as easy as possible to go through that process. You might, for example, leave your pajamas by your bedside. You might lay out your book on the sofa next door if that's what you're going to do, and make sure that you've got a dim lamp by it. So when you are tired and you don't want to get out of bed because it's comfortable, that process is just that little bit easier. Next, ideally you would wake at a consistent time each day. For most people, certainly people who don't have insomnia, I think your alarm should be set as late as possible, only used if you need it to get out of bed for work and make sure that you don't turn up late, for example. But in the case of insomnia, alarm clocks can be beneficial because they regularize your rise time. So they're helping to set the time of your body's clock each day by gating when you're exposed to things like light, which is really important to resetting your clock each day. And they also, by using an alarm clock, will have plenty of time to build up lots of what's called homeostatic sleep drive. You can think of it as your hunger for sleep. The longer that you've been awake without sleep, the more sleepy you are in general. But similar to hunger, it's not like you just feel hungrier and hungrier as time goes by without food. You have peaks and troughs within that, and those peaks and troughs are actually a result of your body's clockwork. So by getting out of bed at a consistent time each day, you're building lots of that sleep hunger. And then by not napping during the day, you're not paying off any of that hunger. You're not sating it in any way. So it's important to not nap in this context too. And then when you go to bed at night, you'll quickly fall asleep and hopefully stay asleep as well. And then finally, during the daytime, save your bed for sex and sleep only. So no reading in bed, no watching TV in bed, certainly no using your phone in bed, which is a really, really common one. And if you can stick to those habits, you will dramatically improve the quality of your sleep if you're currently experiencing insomnia type symptoms. And going back to the idea that this is relevant to exercise and nutrition as well, if you take the example of exercise, a lot of people found it really hard to exercise at home during the COVID pandemic. And that relates to stimulus control. They're not used to exercising at home. They're used to going to the gym. And when they're in the gym, the only thing they do is exercise. It's not true of everyone. You get the occasional meathead who loves hanging out at the gym with all of his lifting buddies, and they spend all the time just talking between sets of curls. But most people use the gym to exercise. And so actually, once they're in the gym, doing some exercise is quite straightforward because that's the association that you have. But if you're used to watching TV in your living room, and now suddenly you're trying to do Peloton workouts or yoga, or you're lifting a little pink dumbbells, then it's much harder. So stimulus control is very relevant to other aspects of our lives too. And you can think about this with respect to things like work. It's easy for work to start to permeate our home lives as well. And being very clear about where you work and when you work is creating good stimulus control and then helping you compartmentalize your life appropriately. And it's the same thing with nutrition. If you snack on the sofa at night, then you're creating a mental association between the sofa and biscuits or crisps or whatever your favorite snack food is. And if your goal is fat loss, then that's not helpful. So if you're struggling to control your weight at the moment, you might think, okay, I'm going to only eat at the dinner table. I'm going to stop snacking on the sofa because that is just encouraging me to snack on the sofa over time. And it's that mindless snacking that's actually creating the caloric excess that's driving my fat gain as time goes by. So I'll pause there because that was a lot, but stimulus control is really important, and hopefully some of those recommendations are helpful.
Super useful. And as someone who struggled with insomnia for years, I wish I had heard all of that before. I needed to meet you 10 years ago, Greg. Where were you? But, everything happens for a reason. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm an ex-insomniac, I wouldn't be so passionate about helping my clients with their sleep. So there we are. But I can relate to a lot of things that you were saying. I remember staring at the clock and staring at my phone, looking the hours pass, and that created such anxiety. I was wondering if we could touch upon the topic as well, which happens to a lot of my clients, and I'm sure it does for yours too, is, okay, they optimize their environment. They understand not to be on their TVs or not to be using blue lights or not to be on their phone. They've optimized their pillows, their mattress, their blanket. They have blackout curtains, right? So they ticked a lot of boxes. But they're thinking about their deadline the next day. They're in their head thinking about what they did wrong at work, the email they sent to their boss that didn't sound or look right, the fact that, one of their son is sick or their daughter has missed something important at school.
Yeah.
How can we help folks that actually struggle most with what's going on in their mind rather than what's going on outside of them?
I'll mention up front that there's a two-way relationship between sleep and psychological health. And so if you improve someone's sleep through things like stimulus control of behavior, change their physical activity, change their caffeine intake, whatever, then psychology does tend to somewhat follow. So you might see improvements in things like anxiety if someone's got a lot going through their mind the whole time. But in terms of specific strategies in that context, it's helpful to not just focus on the behavioral interventions like stimulus control therapy, but also to address those cognitions as well. And interestingly, there's some research suggesting that the behavioral interventions like stimulus control therapy produce larger short-term changes that are sustained in the long term, but some of the cognitive interventions that you can use, they don't work as quickly, but they do produce large changes eventually if you can stick to them. And that's really looking at traditionally used cognitive therapies in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And what I mentioned here don't really fit into that category, but in this context, I think they're really helpful. And so if you are that person who is very busy during the day, and then around the end of the day, you're flooded with concerns about the next day, and when you lie down in bed, you finally have a moment to yourself, and all of these come up to the surface of your mind, then I think some writing practices can be really helpful. And there's one in particular called scheduled worry time, which is very beneficial. And so what you might do in this context is around the end of your working day, it can be any time of day, but the end of the day tends to work well because people are often starting to tie up loose ends from their working day and think about the next day as well. You might sit down with a diary and a pen and spend 10 to 20 minutes on this. And what you can do is just draw a line down the page, slightly left of center. And in the left-hand column, you'll list whatever you're concerned about right now. And to the right of that, you'll list something that you can do about that particular concern. And if you don't feel that there's anything that you can do about it, then that's fine. Just say, right now, this is out of my power. And what you're trying to do is compartmentalize your worry. So you have your 10 to 20 minutes of worry time each day. And at the end of that worry time, you commit to not worrying until your worry time the following day. And obviously you will have worries, but this does tend to alleviate some of that anxiety over time. You can also combine this with making a to-do list. So there's some work on an acute model of insomnia showing that if you have people write a to-do list, then you do tend to improve some measures of sleep quality. So if you just have lots of things that you're trying to hold on to in your mind because you're very busy and you've got to go to the pharmacy to get the Calpol for the kids and you've got to go and pick up something for your partner and you've got all these things that are just cropping up, keeping a to-do list can help you get those out of your mind onto paper, freeing some mental RAM and stopping those worries from flooding in late at night. And if you do that, then you can just keep your diary by your bedside. And then if you have something that comes into your head that you need to get done the next day, you just list that rather than trying to hold on to it in your mind and having that potentially interfere with your sleep. So the combination of trying to have your time to worry, and you can also use stimulus control there, and you can have what's called a worry chair, somewhere where you go during the day to worry. So anytime you feel concerned, you go and sit on your little worry chair.
I think a lot of my clients would argue they spend all day in the worry chair.
Yeah.
All their chairs are worry chairs.
Yeah, it's the worry sofa, the worry chair, the worry bed.
The worry toilet.
It's just worry furniture. But you can use stimulus control there as well. But the point is that you're just trying to create some separation in your life. And that can be really helpful for a lot of people.
So it sounds to me a lot like a technique which we use in hypnotherapy and I use as well in pain control management, where instead of telling the patient or the client, let's ignore the pain, we actually say, okay, and what does the pain feel like? And what does it look like? And where is it in your body? And then we acknowledge it and we soften into it and breathe into it and visualize a color that is calming and peaceful and apply the breath and apply some visualization and healing into that pain, but without bypassing the fact that the pain exists. And actually a key step of pain management is acknowledging the existence of the pain to address the pain. It sounds a lot like that. It's if you have intrusive thoughts, acknowledging the fact that those thoughts are there, taking your pen and paper and writing those worries down with your worry journal or your worry chair sounds a lot like acknowledging physical pain. Can you tell me if you have any insights on that, or how does that sound?
I'll tell you what comes to mind, and I completely agree with the value of that. I think that is part of the reason why meditation is so helpful for chronic pain syndromes, because you're sitting with the pain. And it's not necessarily that over time you're reducing the intensity of the pain, but you're altering your relationship to it. So you're not responding as reflexively as you used to. The other thing that comes to mind is that I think there's been a narrative in recent years that we want to avoid stress and we should do things to try and get rid of stress. But actually, I think all of the evidence indicates that we need to learn how to channel stress appropriately, and that many forms of stress are actually positive, and that viewing stress as something that can lead to growth is something that benefits people. And in recent years, there have been these nice mindset interventions where you teach people about what's called a stress enhancing mindset, and you see improvements in how they respond to stress. David Yeager and some others have done some of that research. But you can give people a short intervention where you literally just teach them about this idea for half an hour. And then even months later, you see reductions in their stress responses to standardized stressors. And so if we can just learn that we shouldn't be trying to avoid stress and discomfort, but actually many forms of stress are stressful for good reasons. Many of the things that are most valuable in life difficult relationships maybe with your partner from time to time, maybe physical challenges, which ultimately become really rewarding because you feel that you've conquered something that previously you had told yourself was not something that you could complete because you're not an athlete. These things have massive value. And actually, ironically, when people try and turn away from stress or physical pain, they tend to exacerbate the problems that they have. And so in the context of stress, what you see with people who avoid stress is that everything becomes stressful because they've shrunk their capacity to cope with it. And so really what we want to always try and do is push to near the limits of our current capacities while allowing sufficient recovery so that we grow back stronger. And this really is the principle that underlies a lot of what people are pushing for nowadays. But you can apply it to many different aspects of your life. So if you think about this in terms of brain health, then you're trying to build cognitive reserve by doing things that are cognitively taxing and focusing on something that's really challenging for a dedicated period of time. Maybe you're learning how to play an instrument. It doesn't have to be something work related, but it's really hard. Or maybe you're learning a language because you want to get a second home somewhere and you'd like to be able to speak with the locals in Portugal. If you think about this in terms of physical activity, then it means that you're going to be lifting weights close to the point where you fail in order to recruit all those motor units, and that's necessary to grow back bigger and stronger. If you think about this in terms of thermoregulation, and this tends to wane as people age. If you're spending time in the sauna, then you're challenging your thermoregulatory capacity, your body's ability to mount appropriate responses to that heat stress so that it can maintain homeostasis or allostasis or whatever you want to call it. So challenging our bodies while allowing sufficient recovery is really important. And I just worry now that a lot of people are trying to shrink wrap themselves and their loved ones. I think we see this a lot with parents. I'm not a parent myself, but people like Jonathan Haidt and others have made a lot of noise about this in recent times. And I think for good reasons. All the evidence suggests that many of the reasons that people nowadays are more anxious at younger ages is that they're not doing these things that are uncomfortable, but ultimately make things that are currently uncomfortable more comfortable.
Yeah, it makes things that are hard seem a little bit less hard. It's really the principle of resilience, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And I know in terms of my recovery from insomnia, which was very much tied with my burnout episode, few things have been really instrumental. Number one is physical exercise. And I had to go through a period which was really tough when I was still underslept, but had to work out to reset that sort of rhythm. So that's the phase that you should discourage folks because it's really hard to put your training shoes on when you haven't slept. And that's the phase that you need to be careful about and not going too crazy about it, but just to gently move your body at least so that you're more physically tired. I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a bit about the connection between physical exertion, or rather the lack of physical exertion, if you spend 12, 13, 14, 15, 20 hours sat down or on the sofa or on the bed, and overexertion of our cognitive power. So on the one hand, our body is not moving all day because we have a sedentary professional service profession. But on the other hand, our brain is overworking all day. How can that impact insomnia potentially and sleep deprivation and other psychological conditions?
I know that this is semantic, but I would very gently push back against the idea that people are overexerting themselves cognitively. I know that you had James Hewitt on the show previously, and he would probably be the first to tell you that the problem is that a lot of people are stuck in the middle gear, where they're doing pseudo work the whole time, and they're not doing any deep work, and they're not allowing any periods of proper recovery where they're task negative, and they're not looking at their phone, they're not checking email, they're not looking at social media on their laptop or whatever. And instead they're doing something which is truly restorative. Maybe they're going for a walk in nature and just enjoying the sensory experience. So with that in mind, I think a lot comes with the work. So if we put aside the actual cognitive load that's involved in those tasks, it might be that there are stressful dynamics at the workplace. It might be that people are trying to cope with the distress in ways that are ultimately unhelpful. There are various different coping strategies and ways of conceptualizing these, but a broad division that I think is helpful is between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping strategies. In the case of problem-focused coping strategies, you're trying to address the problem at hand. So if someone hated their job, then a problem-focused coping strategy might be, I'm going to find a new job. Whereas emotion-focused coping strategies don't focus on trying to change the source of the distress, and instead they focus more on how you actually cope with that. So we spoke earlier about sitting with discomfort. Something like meditation would be one of those, but exercise would be too, because you're exercising in order to improve your body's overall resilience to cope with stress, and that means that you can better cope during the working day with psychological stress and with your high workload and so on. So I think some of it is related to just an unhealthy lifestyle, unhelpful coping strategies, people relying too much on stimulants, for example, maybe people exhausted at the end of the day, making bad health decisions and going for that second glass of wine and then a third glass of wine, instead of choosing things that would be more restorative so that the next day they could hit the ground running. But with respect to the relationship between physical activity and sleep, if you look across the board, then take people who are sedentary, you put them on a structured, appropriate exercise training program, which doesn't have to be anything particularly strenuous. Some activity is better than none. And there's definitely not a linear relationship between exercise load and sleep. It looks more like an inverted U-shaped relationship if we're thinking about someone's sleep health and their activity load. Take someone who's sedentary, their sleep health is not going to be as good as you'd want it to be. You take someone who now does appropriate exercise training. Let's say that it's a mix of different exercise modalities done 3 or 4 days a week within their capacities. It's progressive. Their sleep is going to improve. But if you then push their exercise really hard, and we see this in particular in many athletes, you get to the point of overreaching or even frank overtraining, then their sleep will also deteriorate once more. But if you put someone on an appropriate exercise training program, then they'll tend to fall asleep slightly faster, sleep slightly longer, and they will feel like their sleep is more restorative. You'll also see some change in their sleep architecture. So their sleep might be slightly more efficient. A greater proportion of the time that they're in bed, they will actually be asleep. And some of that just relates to energy expenditure in the body, including the brain. If you look at sleep within the brain, then it's actually something of a local phenomenon. We can't really make the binary division between local and global, but what you see if you look, for example, at someone doing a single cognitive activity where they're trying to focus on one particular task for an extended period of time, after a while, the parts of the brain that are giving rise to performance in that activity start to fatigue because their energy stores are literally becoming depleted. And so you see more what's called slow wave activity, which is the physiological correlative of deep sleep. And so it's like locally in that part of the brain, there is sleep-like behavior. And then that's causing worsened task performance in that. And this is part of the reason why you need breaks, because you're actually physically replenishing the energy substrate stores in those parts of the brain. So if we think about someone who wants to sleep well, then it's a good thing to tax the brain energetically. And that means using your brain in lots of different ways. So doing something that's physically challenging, doing something that's cognitively challenging, learning something new, meeting people, interacting with people, exploring new places. All of that is challenging the brain in different ways. And that is going to be conducive to healthy sleep, in part just because of energy metabolism. And I think that's a large part of the reason why exercise is so good for sleep health. There are some other components too, probably related to things like body temperature regulation and the endocrine system, so change in certain hormones that might facilitate healthy sleep. But I think a lot of it is actually happening locally, parts of the brain that are supporting task performance in those activities.
I'm glad that you just mentioned hormones, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the impact of lack of sleep or chronic sleep deficiency and hormone dysregulation. Specifically, I'm thinking about cortisol, melatonin. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, especially knowing that your PhD was partly on circadian rhythm? I think you would be a wonderful expert to give us your insights on that.
Certainly, the effects of sleep on the hormone system or the endocrine system are relatively pervasive. And so we could focus on many different hormones involved in different processes, but I'll just give a few examples. You mentioned cortisol, for example. You do tend to see disrupted cortisol rhythms in people who are either short on sleep or experiencing different sleep issues. So it could be some sort of frank sleep disorder. There are 6 broad categories of those, and the insomnias are one of those, but there are others too. And you might see in certain insomnia phenotypes or certain flavors of insomnia, for example, that cortisol rhythm doesn't look the way that it does in people with healthy sleep. In people with healthy sleep, what you should see is a strong surge in cortisol around the time that someone wakes up. It's called the cortisol awakening response. And the purpose of this is to basically ready your body for the stress of the day ahead. It increases your blood pressure, it mobilizes energy reserves, and so on. And then over the course of the day, you should see that the background level of cortisol will tend to wane and then reach the low point in the sleep period before that cortisol awakening response the next day. In insomnia, though, because people have that type of conditioned arousal where they're anticipating difficulty sleeping, you can see quite a different cortisol rhythm. And actually, you can see cortisol go up in anticipation of bedtime and then stay higher during the sleep period. And so it's like the rhythm has been shifted upward and flattened. And that's probably contributing to some of the difficulties that they face, including some of the psychological distress. In terms of food intake, which we discussed earlier, there do seem to be some changes. The evidence is somewhat equivocal, but if someone isn't getting enough sleep, then it could be that you see an increase in the appetite stimulating hormone ghrelin and or a decrease in leptin, or it could be that the ratio of those two hormones changes with the net effect of promoting greater food intake for a lot of individuals. I think it's probably better demonstrated that you see change in some of the hormones that are involved in things like how your blood sugar responds to meals. So very consistently, when people don't get enough sleep, their blood sugar gets substantially worse. You can take people with healthy glycemic control and restrict their sleep for several days, and temporarily they would be classified as pre-diabetic. Eve Van Kelter did the early work on that, and it's been replicated over and over again. And so there's clearly insulin insensitivity that is taking place in response to insufficient sleep. And that has all sorts of knock-on consequences for various different body systems. And then in terms of reproductive function, there are probably some changes too. Again, this hasn't been that consistently shown, but there's certainly evidence that in the case of men, chronic insufficient sleep will tend to lower testosterone levels over time. It might be that people of different ages are slightly more sensitive or less sensitive to that. And in the case of women, there are likely some changes too. But for both men and women, it does seem that various different forms of sleep disruption can disrupt reproductive function in general. So you might see, for example, greater rates of difficulty conceiving among people who work shifts as opposed to people who don't work shifts. And obviously, in the case of women, there's also the menopausal transition, which massively affects sleep for a lot of people. And a lot of people find that if they go on hormone replacement therapy, then their difficulty sleeping improves dramatically. They don't get the same hot flashes and so on, which disrupt their sleep. So there are differences between the sexes that we need to be cognizant of. But in general, there are those themes. And then finally, you mentioned cortisol. Finally, you mentioned melatonin, sorry. And melatonin really is the hormone of darkness. And what I mean by that is that it's the hormone that is produced by the pineal gland in the brain to signal the biological nighttime to cells throughout your body. And so in a healthy system, what you should see is that roughly 2 hours before you fall asleep, the brain starts synthesizing, releasing more melatonin. And then that continues until around the end of the sleep period, which is the melatonin offset. And melatonin is then acting on a couple of receptors on cells throughout the body to tell those cells, it's the nighttime, do your nighttime activities. So that's going to have different effects on the gut versus the pancreas and so on. That can be disrupted primarily by inappropriate patterns of light exposure. And so now we live in this 24/7 society where we can control the light environment with the flick of a switch at any time of day. And if your sleep environment has lots of light pollution, particularly if it's short wavelength, rich light, red light doesn't have such a pronounced effect on melatonin synthesis, then you will change your melatonin rhythm. Something that I always try and emphasize, which a lot of people miss, is that the important thing here is the contrast between your light exposure during the daytime and your light exposure at night. Because people become terrified of small amounts of short wavelength light from screens before bed. They think, oh, the smartphone used before bed is going to ruin my sleep because of the light exposure, or the TV, or the laptop, whatever. And it's not the case. Certainly not the case if you're spending plenty of time outdoors during the day, because if you look at the intensity of light outdoors here right now, it's 5 p.m., it's a sunny day, and where I am, the intensity is probably something like 60,000 lux right now. In this room right now, it's probably 300 lux, so 200 times brighter outdoors than it is in here. And you're not going to get a really intense light exposure from your smartphone, especially if you've dialed down the brightness settings. So if you're spending at least an hour outdoors during the day, which could be snacky on light, so it could be 15 minutes here and 10 minutes there, then you're giving your body a strong daylight cue, which is anchoring the timing of your body's clock and making it more resistant to being shifted around by small amounts of light at night. So focus on getting plenty of daylight exposure during the day. Sit by windows when you can. Have your meals outdoors when you can. Go for a walk during the working day, ideally after meals, because that's going to help with your blood sugar control to those meals. Ideally in nature, and ideally not doing anything, looking at your phone or anything like that. And you're going to sleep better for it. And that's in part because of the effects on your body's clock. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Greg. That was really interesting. I was wondering if I could ask you about one more topic before I wrap us up. I really love your work around jet lags, and I've read and consumed a lot of your content around jet lags, recommendation, tips and tricks, and a lot of our listeners are high flyers. Yeah. So I would like to know if you could share some top tips on how to mitigate jet lag. I know that long flights across the globe constantly are not ideal for health, but I also know that it's a fact of life, particularly when you're a global executive or you're leading a team internationally. Yeah. Let's assume that we have to take those flights and we have to travel constantly. How can we mitigate the negative impact? Nutrition, sleep-wise, metabolic-wise, tell us more.
Sure. Yeah, and we could do a 10-part series of podcasts about jet lag specifically. This is the difficulty in just kind of glossing over each of these different subjects. But that is the nature of podcasts and part of the fun of them. So
we might have to do jet lags podcast on the plane to keep it. I know you travel as much as I do, so it would be ironical to do a jet lag podcast in an airport lounge. Seeing us both with our blue light blockers and our EMF blankets. And
I am that guy with the blue blockers too.
I am that girl too. I'm traveling with my food bags, etc.
Yeah, I'm just on the back of an 8-hour time zone shift, so I know that jet lag is real. But
So tell us, how do you make it through the day?
So I would split this into two things. I would differentiate jet lag from travel fatigue. Travel fatigue is a product of traveling in general. So if you imagine you're not traveling across time zones, you're staying in the same longitude, you're just going vertically north or south. You're not going to get jet lag, but if you have a 40-hour journey, you're going to be tired. And you're going to be exposed to a bunch of things that are going to interfere with your ability to sleep well. They're also going to expose you to new pathogens, so they're going to make infections more likely, for example. So there are things that we can do related to travel fatigue, and a lot of that relates to appropriate planning. Things like making sure that you've got healthy snacks available, things like taking your eye mask and your earplugs with you, things like arranging for comfortable layovers, if at all possible, things like appropriate hand hygiene to deal with those novel pathogens. There are probably some supplements that you could take potentially to try and mitigate things like traveler's diarrhea. So there's travel fatigue, but then jet lag really is a function of disruption to your body's clock. And you have the system of clocks that optimize the timing of different processes in tissues throughout your body according to time of day. And when you move across several time zones, these clocks throughout your system are trying to catch up with the new time zone. And they adjust at different rates. And this is part of the reason why for a lot of people, they might have some digestive symptoms initially, but after a couple of days, they're gone. Whereas they still have nighttime insomnia and daytime cognitive dysfunction for several more days after that. And that's because the gut clock is adjusted faster than the master clock, which is determining their melatonin rhythm, core body temperature rhythm, when they're best able to sleep and when they're most alert and so on. And so the jet lag component really relates to trying to synchronize these clocks to the new time zone as quickly as possible. And that comes down to appropriate patterns of light exposure and also appropriate timing of physical activity and appropriate timing of food intake. And there are other things that you could do. For example, if you're heading several time zones east, taking melatonin can be helpful. Difficulty in melatonin is just sourcing a good product. And so got no affiliation with the company whatsoever, but in general, Life Extension and Swanson products tend to check out. So assuming that you're not taking prescription melatonin, which I'm sure you won't be, but you want to take melatonin for travel, I would probably just take a 1 milligram or 3 milligram melatonin product. It could be anywhere between 300 micrograms and 5 milligrams, but something in the 1 to 3 milligram range is going to work well for a lot of people from one of those two suppliers is probably quite a helpful choice. And you can just use that when you're going in that direction, if it makes sense. So the question then is, when does it make sense? And again, zero affiliation with them whatsoever, but the Time Shifter app is great. It's a really good app. And I would just download Time Shifter and follow the guidance. It will give you personalized recommendations regarding when to expose yourself to bright light, when to avoid light, when to nap, and when to consume caffeine. And you can also choose whether you want to take melatonin to get over jet lag faster, if it makes sense in that context, because it doesn't always. If you're going 5 time zones west, it probably won't make any sense to take it. If you're going 8 time zones east, then you can probably get over the jet lag faster if you take the melatonin. So I would use the Time Shifter app. I haven't used the latest version of it, but assuming that it hasn't changed that much, I think what it is arguably missing is more particular guidance about things like activity. If you look at how your body's clock changes in response to physical activity, while this hasn't been that well studied yet, and this is the reason why it's missing from the app, I'm sure, it does seem that doing strenuous exercise late in the biological day, so in the few hours before you naturally fall asleep, will tend to shift your clock a little bit later, whereas doing that same type of exercise shortly after waking will tend to shift your clock a bit earlier. And so if you look at the Time Shifter recommendations, when it's telling you to expose yourself to bright light, if you can be physically active at those times too, let's say that you're scheduling some exercise sessions, I think you can get over jet lag faster still that way. I also think that you can do things with your nutrition. And maybe the most important of these is after your first proper sleep in the new time zone, fully shift your meals to the new time zone. There's lots of hand waving about what to do between when you leave your point of departure and when you arrive at your destination. Honestly, it's not clear what is best during that time. Some people will fast, some people will use some sort of skeleton meal pattern, some people will just do whatever they want and capitalize on the free alcohol on the plane. So I think instead of all of that, during that transition, having some healthy snacks handy, and I'd focus on high protein, relatively high fiber snacks and consuming plenty of fluid, because your blood sugar control is going to be worse during that time. Your appetite control might be worse too, you're going to be sleeping worse. And so by consuming those high fiber, high protein foods, you're mitigating the tendency to overeat and you're supporting your fat-free mass while also keeping your blood sugar levels in check and your blood fat levels in check. Just make sure that when you're at the new destination, fully shift your meals to the new time zone. That is going to tend to work quite well. So I think those are probably the main points for people. And then you mentioned blue blockers at the start. They definitely can be helpful. Maybe some people feel like they look too silly when they wear them, in which case you can just use sunglasses instead and wear a cap too. That's going to reduce your light exposure. But I think blue blocking glasses make the most sense in that context, and also for people with circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders. So people with shift work disorder, people with certain body clock disorders related to very early or very late sleep respectively, they can benefit from smart use of blue blockers. But for the general public, I think they come into their own during jet lag specifically.
You mentioned silly, but I think they're arguably cool looking. At least you get some attention in the airport.
Yeah. I don't know how many people would agree with you, Charlene, but...
Oh, well. And I'm really glad that you touched upon the topic of supplementation, because I personally love taking probiotic and magnesium, particularly before long flights, because I find that it just really helps combat any of those potential digestive issues or bloating, particularly with probiotics. If I have a little bit less control over what I'm going to eat for 24 hours, then I find that magnesium also helps for me to recover from jet lag a bit quicker. Any thoughts on those practices?
I think the probiotics are interesting in the context of traveler's diarrhea. And there are certain strains that have been studied in that context, and they might be helpful. So that is how I would personally use probiotics, absent other information, because someone might be using probiotics anyway for a very specific health condition or outcome of interest. And then in terms of magnesium, I am very pro magnesium supplementation for the vast majority of people. Most people benefit impressively from magnesium supplementation, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. There's so much nonsense about magnesium out there. People massively overthinking types of magnesium, spending a fortune on magnesium 3 and 8, and all these novel forms of magnesium that have barely been studied. Just go to PubMed and search PubMed for clinical trials on these different forms of magnesium. Pretty much all the research is on magnesium oxide, magnesium citrate, magnesium chloride. Oxide can cause some GI issues for some people. And so I tend to just default to magnesium citrate. It's inexpensive and it works really well for its intended effects. And when people take it, I tend to see meaningful improvements in certain cardiometabolic health parameters, like blood sugar control, possibly their blood pressure, some of their blood lipids. And provided that the dose is appropriate, they won't have any GI effects. And the bioavailability of citrate is very good. So I'm a fan of magnesium citrate. Would I use it as something to help with jet lag per se? No. But do I think most people should take it anyway? Yes. And do I think most people should continue their regular supplementation while they're traveling if it's practical? Yeah, ideally. In terms of other things, the things that come to mind for me are supplements, in inverted commas, that really are just used as meal replacements. Just given the quality of plain food and given people's access to healthy food while traveling in certain parts of the world. I'm in Indonesia right now, and I'm therefore eating an enormous amount of white rice and fried chicken because that comes with the territory, which isn't ideal. And so for me, my supplementation out here is different from what it would be if I was in England and I was eating a lot more vegetables and pulses and fish and very little fried food. So bear that in mind. And I think while traveling, things like certain prebiotic fibers, like inulin, would be a good choice for a lot of people, because many people find that they're prone to constipation because maybe they're consuming less fiber, for instance, or maybe that's a symptom they experience when they have jet lag. And then otherwise, people might use things like protein powders if they're struggling to access high quality source of protein. They might use a multivitamin during that time. So I take a multivitamin while traveling, but I certainly don't at home. And then finally, I mentioned that people were more prone to certain infections. I think jet lag is just ripe for some sort of infection. So many people seem to pick up COVID or a cold when they travel across many different time zones, because the sleep loss and the circadian disruption are both impairing immune function, and they're exposed to this new burden of pathogens. And so many people are bound to get something. And to keep colds at bay, the best proven supplement is zinc acetate lozenges. And so for me, I tend to have some handy if I go traveling. And then if I wake up one day and I've got a bit of a scratchy throat and I've got those early small red flags popping up, then I might start using zinc acetate lozenges, because it's clear based on the research that if they're taken around the onset of a cold, then they reduce the duration and the severity of the cold. It probably needs to be zinc acetate specifically, and you probably should take something like 10 milligrams of elemental zinc each time. A lot of the research is having people take about 9 of those each day. And you just leave them on the inside of your cheek and let them dissolve. And it just interferes with the ability of the virus to bind, and therefore reduces the severity and duration of symptoms. So for people who are traveling a lot and are prone to colds during that time, I think it's a really easy win. There hasn't really been much good research on that in the context of COVID, but they're relatively inexpensive and people might only have to use them once, twice a year. So I just think there's going to be no harm that comes of that. You might as well give that a go if you're having those early symptoms, and you might manage to avert something that would have more significantly hampered how you feel and your performance, and also possibly your health in the long term. If you look, for example, at people's experiences of coughs and colds and various types of infections, then there's quite a strong relationship with risk of certain neurodegenerative diseases and other health conditions over time. So it's not like it's just something that affects you for a week, once, twice a year. These exposures do add up over time. And so I think it makes sense to try and mitigate them when possible.
Greg, we've learned so much together with you today, and I would love to direct our audience to your great podcast, Reason and Wellbeing, and particularly you released a solo episode on sleep, which I will add in the show notes so that our audience can continue to learn more. Can you perhaps tell us what would be the best way for our listeners to connect with you and get to know you better and your research and how you can connect?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So yes, podcast is Reason and Wellbeing. And if you found anything from today interesting, then I think you'll enjoy that. And actually, I think the solo episodes are probably the worst, and the episodes with guests are substantially better. So do check those out. In terms of the subjects today, I have done a couple of solo episodes on circadian biology and several on sleep now. But the podcast isn't just about those subjects. It's much more expansive than that. And so far we've covered everything from back pain to blood donation to obesity to individual supplements like creatine and lithium. And over time, I want to expand the range of subjects even more. But really, it's about how do we use reason and science to live better lives. And like you, I think, Charlene, I really enjoy it. And I'm maybe not as regular as I could be just because I've got other things and podcasting doesn't really pay the bills. So it tends to fall by the wayside periodically, but I do really enjoy that. And I'm very particular with my guests. So the people that come on do know their stuff. So that is part of the fun. And then otherwise, I am periodically on social media. I've just started using Instagram again after a break. I tend to take a break or two each year because it can drive me nuts. But yes, I am at Greg Potter PhD on Instagram, and you can message me there and I will get back to you. But yeah, I would definitely direct people to the podcast and then the associated YouTube channel, which is also at Greg Potter PhD, which so far is just recordings of the podcasts, but in the future there will be additional content there too.
Thank you. I'll be sure to add the podcast in the show notes. I'm really grateful for all your insights. It was wonderful to have that conversation with you, and I feel very encouraged to go and have a good night's sleep now.
Good. In the face of dengue fever. I hope that happens.
Well, you're in Asia too. These things happen, right?
They do. But that, yeah. I hope that your recovery is as quick as possible, and it doesn't take its toll.
For context, for our listeners, I found out this morning that I had dengue fever. So there we go.
And she's still here. That's commitment.
Commitment. Well, yes. I couldn't cancel you, Greg. I was looking forward to speaking with you for too long, and I wanted to honor our time together. So thank you.
Thank you for making it.
Take care. You just heard us talk about supplementation and in particular magnesium to optimize sleep. I've been using magnesium supplementation for many years to improve my sleep. And the one brand that I trust and use is Bioptimizer. If you are in the US and want to experience using magnesium to improve your sleep, I highly recommend magnesium from Bioptimizer. You can use your promo code Charlene Giselle at checkout to try out their magnesium. And if you're living in the UK, then you can use my promo code Charlene10 at checkout to get your exclusive discount and experience magnesium to optimize a good night's sleep. Have a great day and rest well tonight to sleep well.